Well, thank you very much for joining us for this panel. So we are reconvening now our session, and we're going to continue the discussion on the theme of this conference, of this inaugural meeting of the AOAC section for Sub-Saharan Africa, and how food safety can be an enabler to building more trade, enhanced public health, and also to supporting thriving economies. And we have with us a number of panelists, key opinion leaders in their respective areas. And I would like, in fact, to start by two representatives of the sector, of the food production sector. Essentially, we all know that Africa represents, in fact, the future in a number of economic studies. It has great potential in of course, the abundant resources that are available, human resources as well, that are developing throughout the continent, and the level of investment that is happening within the continent. The food production sector happens to be, in general, also an area where, in emerging economies, it tends to fuel the economy of the region. And as we all know, food safety can be, in fact, an enabler to the food production sector, but it can be also a challenge for the development of the sector. So if I could ask both representatives of the industry, if you could actually help us paint a picture of the food safety landscape in the sub-region or in the continent overall, what you see in terms of challenges, what you may see potentially in terms of opportunities, not stopping at the challenge level, because there is an important level of investment in capacity building in food safety, and how can that be translated into an opportunity? So if I could ask Linda to start us off.
Sure, thank you very much. And that is a very big question, which I will try and answer as best as I can. Maybe just to give you context to the Food Safety Initiative and our role there, basically all those member companies are members of our organisation, and we spend a lot of time going and meeting with different government departments around regulations. So one of our major focus areas is helping to ensure compliance with regulations. And in that, we come across a number of challenges, in that the food control system in South Africa is very complicated. And I don't have the experience on the continent or even elsewhere, but it's quite fragmented. So we have regulations that affect food that are under the Department of Trade and Industry, of Department of Agriculture, Department of Health, and basically all of those affect food and how it needs to be produced from a compositional level, but also from a safety and even, to my background, a nutrition and a public health level. So our role is really to be in touch and advise people about regulations that they need to comply to, but it is quite a challenge to be on top of all of this. And some of the regulations are at a very high level, which are, I suppose, at sometimes better than some of the top countries in the world, but some need a lot of work, so there are gaps in regulations too. So essentially, I think from our standpoint, there is a role for collaboration and having platforms like this where we can have discussions with all of the relevant stakeholders, people who manufacture food, people who regulate it, people who care about public health, who care about public safety in terms of food and nutrition, and have discussions around making it better, because I think there's a lot good to be said about it, but there's a way to go when it comes to South Africa, and as I say, I'm not as familiar with the continent and possibly internationally. So I don't know if that I could start as an opening remark, from our side.
Well, Linda, thank you. You set me up very nicely to broaden it out a little bit across the continent. And when you talk about some gaps in conformity, gaps in harmonisation in the South African context, I think, Eve, you'd agree that multiplies itself manyfold when you start to look across the continent. We, as an organisation, we've got one global safety and quality standard, because if we make and manufacture a different quality, safety and standard here in Africa than we do, say, in Europe, we'll soon get found out, and rightly so, called to account. So we build our own infrastructure, we build our own food safety infrastructure, like the facility we have here in Clayville, Quality Assessment Centre, that tests to 1725. And we make that investment, and we also use it as a place where we engage with government. So we've engaged today with about 10 different African governments. We brought them here for capacity building, and the reason we do that is because we think it's an investment very well worth making. Because, let me just give you a very practical example. Most best practice around food safety talks about a farm to fork approach. And HACCP basically is a principle whereby we manage the different risk points in the chain. In many of our sub-Saharan countries, that exists to differing degrees, or the capacity to do that exists to differing degrees, which means you often get something called pre-market approval. So if you're manufacturing in 17 factories across 54 countries, you've got to move products across borders. Now, if you've got to register those products, individual products, even within one economic community, one regional economic community, multiple times, that's a great inhibitor to speed to market. And we've noticed that other parts of the world, like Vietnam, for example, where they had similar capacity issues, but they're already beginning to do away and move to a process-based approach rather than a product registration-based approach. And this is the kind of forum, I think, that can ultimately help facilitate that shift, because it's going to help that development of intra-African trade and trade beyond the continent as well. So I'll leave it at that for my opening remarks. Thanks.
Sure. So I guess actually in an attempt really to summarize some of the key themes that are emerging here. So definitely there's the issue of fragmentation of the competent authorities, of the level of oversight, definitely within one country here, the South African experience, but also more likely also throughout the continent itself. The discrepancy in capabilities within the continent or sub-regions of the continent, leading also to differences in food regulatory systems and actually creating some of the challenges in terms of various requirements to move products over. And I guess to go back to some of the issues that Eve mentioned in her keynote speech, and also in other presentations of the morning, the issue of intra-regional trade being impeded. Now, I've heard you, John, mention investment in some capacity in the country here. But again, we know that because of some of the challenges that you've mentioned and others, and particularly because of the differences in levels, there are investments in food safety capacity building. And these are treated really like an investment, meaning they are meant to, of course, address the issue for which they are targeted, but they are meant also to have, hopefully, a greater benefit, and greater benefit on the aspects that we are discussing as part of our panel. So essentially on that overall economic growth, but also human development, we hope. I would like to ask our panelists, based on your experience with some food safety capacity building initiatives that either you've witnessed or you have been involved in, how could we see, in fact, that return of investment being manifested in terms of food safety capacity building? And I don't know, Andrew or Paul, if you'd like to start us off. So, Paul.
Thanks a lot for that, Sandra. Yeah, I think we heard from me this morning about the numerous barriers to trade that exist. But the example that I'm going to cite is a little bit more specific, and it really feeds into Ravi's discussion earlier about how we can alleviate rural poverty. So this example that I have comes from India, and frequently we talk about market access as being one of the returns on investment, but this particular example doesn't involve essentially just market access. The Indian grape producers have been able to export their grapes to the European Union for a long time. And back in 2006, however, they were finding issues with pesticide occurrence in those grapes. And when you look at the price, the unit price that they were getting for the grapes compared to in the United Kingdom, as an example, and compared to what the United Kingdom were paying for Chilean grapes, they were getting something like about 50 to 60% of the unit price of the Chilean grapes. So in other words, the Indian grapes weren't perceived as having the same quality or as good a quality as the Chilean grapes. and part of this may have been due to the occurrence of these pesticides. So the trade promotion body in India, the Agricultural Products Export Development Agency, instituted a certification program. So this is something that's really quite relevant for this group, because most of you people in this room will be lab-based, and really this gives you an example of how your lab-based testing activities can really help to this greater overarching goal of alleviation of rural poverty. So the APEDA organisation instituted a certification scheme where all the grapes destined for the European Union needed to be sampled 3 weeks prior to harvesting and tested in a certified accredited laboratory, and the pesticides were assessed on those, and on the basis of that a certificate was issued stating which European countries those grapes could be sold to. So this was prior to the harmonisation of the pesticide residues across Europe. So in 2006 they were achieving something like about 50% to 60% of the price they were getting for that the UK was paying for Chilean grapes. At the current state, and we've seen a steady increase of this, but at the current state now with this certification scheme, it would appear that the perceived value, the perceived quality of those grapes has increased significantly, because they're now commanding something like a 20 to 25% premium on the same grapes that are now being exported to the European Union, and that premium is going directly back to the smallholding farmers. So I think even on looking beyond the scale of just generally getting market access, this idea that we've heard a lot about this morning of building trust in the systems, building trust in the quality of the food that's being produced, really can have an economic benefit.
Thank you for that example. Clear, value added as a result of enhanced food safety and trust. Andrew.
Yeah, I have a number of examples I could give, but I'll choose one from this region to start with anyway. We had a couple of projects with Benin over the last number of years, and one of those was looking at a problem with export of pineapples to the European Union. Now, pineapple, I think, is the third most important export commodity from, in agricultural terms, from Benin to, especially to the European Union. However, people in Europe like yellow pineapples. They don't like green pineapples. Okay, so they used ethylene, a chemical, to produce the yellow colour. And although the percentage of export of production of pineapples was only 2% that was exported, yellow pineapples, to the EU, it made up about 50% of the revenue coming in because of the added value. However, when the ethylene was discovered at twice the levels that it should be in a number of countries, exports were rejected, and at that stage, in 2015, Benin decided to put a self-imposed ban on exporting until they get things in order. Now, working with and our projects, I have to say that they're not, the results are not all from us. We work with many other players. But one of the things that we did was work with the LCSSA in Benin to improve the standards of the laboratory and allow them to do the testing for this chemical. And eventually the lab achieved accreditation from Belgium. And that allowed them to export again to the European Union. So there's a big monetary, a quantifiable monetary advantage there, which is not always easy to do, because in many cases what we do is maintaining trade under the onslaught of increasingly stringent regulations, and that's not easy to quantify. In this case, it could be quantified. I don't know the figures, but it can be quantified. But also, secondary to that, it was estimated that about 50% of the workforce in the farms, the pineapple farms, was laid off basically during that period. So it had a huge impact on employment. As a follow-on to that, the accreditation allowed Benin to establish the requirements to export honey to the European Union just earlier this year. It was finally approved when the Food and Veterinary Office did an inspection. They produce about 600,000 tonnes of honey per year, and the market previously was basically a local countries market, and that's the development goal for that was to increase exports by about 3 times. Now they're able to do that, so again that'll be a huge benefit. which is probably quantifiable by someone in the future, by economists.
Thank you. These are clear, concrete examples. John?
Yeah, I have another one from Africa as well, this time from West Africa. And it concerns, well, we have an ambition to get as much locally sourced as we possibly can. It makes all the sense in the world for us to do that for our factories operating in Africa. Now, sometimes it's quality and safety that gets in the way of that. And I'll give you the specific example of a breakfast cereal product we have in Nigeria called Golden Morn, very, very successful product. In 2008, we were having to import 80% of the maize that went into that product because of aflatoxin contamination of local maize. So again, we partnered with IITA, train the trainer program, 3,000 farmers to start with, basically post-harvest and storage practices which were the basic cause of the aflatoxin contamination. And in the course of 7 years, we trained 80,000 farmers, half of them were women. They doubled their income. We reduced our factory gate rejections from 50% to 3%. And we then reduced our import dependence commensurately. And that, for me, is very powerful. A powerful reason to invest in food safety capacity building. And I'd love to see that replicated elsewhere on the continent.
I would like that actually, these numbers propagated further, frankly, to encourage more capacity building investment, because these are very concrete examples as to the benefits, particularly from an economic nature. And of course, I mean, beyond that, there's definitely all the other aspects of public health and human development that comes with those progresses. I guess in a number of your examples that you mentioned that such investment actually relied on enhancing the capacity of the laboratories up to the level of accreditation. The word of accreditation was mentioned at least in two of your examples. And again, accreditation is one of the ways that helps create more trust, support confidence in the results that are provided by a food testing laboratory. And we enjoy today the presence of the CEO of the accreditation body of South Africa. And I would like to ask him about your experience here in South Africa in getting laboratories, food testing laboratories accredited. What are the challenges that are faced by those? And what can we do? What type of investment may be needed in order to support further increase of the number of labs that can achieve that level of accreditation, particularly against ISO 17025?
Okay. Thank you very much for that question. If you allow me, I just want to expand a little bit more, and I would like to thank the previous speakers. So I don't have to talk too much about the economic value of accreditation issues. I think that has been nicely explained in terms of that. By way of an example, I want to also just highlight some of the importance of accreditation in the context of health and safety, as well as economic development issues. And then I will touch on the issue of capacity building. A few months ago, I received a call from my organization, which is the Department of Trade and Industry. It was probably past 8 o'clock in the evening, saying that the Minister of Health will have a press briefing the next morning, and they need experts to come and talk. We had a problem with listeriosis, and he was going to make an announcement on that particular day, and he needed the expertise to talk to those particular issues. At that point in time, we didn't know what the cause was, and we didn't know where it originated from either. And so part of our responsibility as an accreditation body was to help the Department of Health identify those through those accredited organizations by providing information from the accredited organizations to that. In South Africa, listeriosis was not a notifiable disease, so there was no legal obligation to notify when such has come to the fore. Within that process, about 978 laboratories, nationally and internationally, was involved in trying to find the cause of that. By that time, 183 people has died already. Eventually, in March, we found the problem. And two particular issues kick in. The one is the recall part. with recall, economic issues started to kick in. One of our organizations, which is probably one of the strongest brands we had, which is Tiger Brands, we found that it is actually part of their cause that has caused the listeriosis issue. The economic impact was quite huge. They lost more than 365 million, and it's still climbing in terms of those issues. Today, just now recently in August, their sales figures and all of those down by more than 10%, which obviously, as you want to take that further, impacts on people's lives, impacts on jobs and things, and sustainability and affordability issues. And therefore the issues of accreditation becomes quite important at the end of the process, to be able to give confidence to the market, not only in terms of health and safety, but also the unintended consequences thereof in terms of the economic impact it might have. The key question that you asked me in terms of what is needed, the issue of capacity building, that's quite an important subject or point that needs to be addressed. And I divide it normally into three particular areas. In three areas, the one of infrastructure capacity, skills capacity, and willingness capacity. When I talk about willingness capacity, I'm talking about the willingness of governments and individuals to make those choices, either to regulate, either to support, either to give and accept conformity assessment results. I think one of the biggest issues in the WTO right now, the discussion, is the mutual acceptance of conformity assessment data. And it was mentioned just now in terms of the obstacles that people have to go through because conformity assessment results are not necessarily accepted. It's used in most countries as a barrier to trade, to keep out certain goods and services, also protectionist measure to protect the local markets, etc. So within the willingness area, therefore, we got a lot of work to do. I think the president or the previous president on his slide, he talked about the issues of government and government involvement in your global stakeholder partnership issues. You've got that particular area as well as a highlight area. There's a lot of work to be done in that particular process. That's a need to make sure that not only the testing, certification, inspection results are accepted, but there's a broader acceptance in terms of understanding the role that it plays within the health, safety, and environment protection, as well as economic growth of a country. The second area that we talk about is infrastructure capacity. Infrastructure capacity in Africa, we've gone a long way. Eve has talked about it, and Reynard has talked about it quite a bit, what we're doing in Africa. In South Africa, for instance, we have what we call as well the quality infrastructure or technical infrastructure, which is our Standards Bureau, our accreditation body, our Metrology Institute, and our National Regulator for Compulsory Specification that deals with market surveillance issues. On the regional level, we have a similar structure which deals with the standards, which is also AFRIC with the accreditation issue, AFRIMET with metrology, and AFSEC that deals with electrotechnical standards. Those bodies are coordinated by the Pan-African Quality Infrastructure, as Eve already highlighted. And globally, those link into what we call nowadays, and they have now organized themselves in the IQNet system, which basically deals with the major bodies, the OML, ILAC, IAF, ISO, IEC. In fact, the World Bank is there, and a few more others is there, dealing with the global technical infrastructure, quality infrastructure, which is the latest buzzword everywhere you go, quality infrastructure in terms of that. So principally, in structure, in infrastructure, we are getting there. A lot of work has been done in terms of the standards development. A lot of work has been done in terms of accreditation. Currently, we have 7 accreditation bodies on the continent, one covering the Southern Africa, about 13 countries in Southern Africa. And then we have Egypt, we have Ethiopia, we have Kenya, Tunisia, Egypt as well, all part of that process. That's the easy part. The structural part is the easy part to do. The next one is the skills capacity area. And in particular, that particular area, in the field of food safety and food security, it food security, it becomes more and more important that bigger investments need to be done at that particular level. Investments in and people understand the origin of food, where it comes from food labeling, food hygiene, the issues of food additives, and the food pesticides that was talked about. More and more research needs to be done in those particular areas to be able to provide. So the question that you asked me in terms of where more support is needed for laboratory, support is needed in terms of capacity building at all three of those levels.
Thank you for that. So not only investment in infrastructure and in the governance structure and organization, but also investing in those human resources and the skill sets to be able to supply the continent and the region with what it needs. And I guess actually in what you mentioned, and also in the previous presentations that we've heard this morning, part of achieving, that confidence, for example, through accreditation, is the reliance on references, the reliance on elements that will allow us to calibrate the instrumentation that would allow us to have the references for the materials that we are testing. And I guess metrology institutes play a key role in enabling that. And we have with us the CEO of the National Metrology Institute of South Africa, which plays actually a role not only in the country, but also, as I understand it, at the regional level. And I would like to ask you, in fact, to comment on the role that you play in supporting, more confidence in the food safety testing environment, but also considering the fact of the launch of this subsection of the section of the AOAC in Sub-Saharan Africa, and the role of AOAC in helping standardization of methods. How can potentially a collaboration could be developed in order to support you in your function and in the mandate of everybody else who is contributing to food safety? Not a small question. They never are, by the way. You probably noticed that. But that's kind of my signature on all the questions. So please, sorry about that.
I don't know, Sam, if it's because I'm sitting in the center and I make it the most difficult question. But I think let me just start by first appreciating the comments that have already been made. Some of the points have been touched in the comments that have been made in terms of the need for establishing that confidence in the measurement that get done in relation to food safety. But in terms of establishing that confidence, I think it's very important to note that it's imperative for countries, for the region as a whole, to establish a stronger measurement capability so that the work of accreditation gets made easier in terms of ensuring that when the assessors go out, there is a proof for traceability to the international system of standards, which is the SI units. And that is achieved through establishing national measurement standards that all the measurements get traceable to. I think, as Ron said, that creates a slightly easier process of establishing the institutions, the infrastructure, and so on and so on. It gets complicated when you have specific matrices that are peculiar to an environment, that now when you do the measurements, it's not on matrices that gets used elsewhere in the world. It's matrices like cassava that are more relevant to us, that are more specific to our region. That now when those reference materials come as pure reference material, you've got to make up solutions in the matrices and then calibrate the equipment. And I think when we looked at it as the National Metrology Institute of South Africa and the metrology system across the continent, we realized something needs to be done, and there needs to be capacity building in that specific area of ensuring that we have reference material that are fit for purpose for our region, such that we don't find ourselves being at a disadvantage. Vainan spoke about shortening the traceability chain, and as the NMI say, we crafted our strategy in dealing with this along the theme of shortening the traceability chain for Africa. And this also means in this reference material, we established a capability for developing reference material that are matrix for the continent, that we are able to also develop new products using our own matrices and export them into the rest of the world. So with that comes the challenge of how do you train people in the continent to use this reference material? And we've looked at a gap that exists in as much as we are a metrology institute, we need in the continent to take note of the fact that we are not as developed as the rest of the world. So there are certain gaps that needs to be filled. And one of the ways we are trying to deal with that challenge is establishing a food safety center of excellence in the NMISA that will serve the rest of the continent in training, not only in testing, but also getting the methods. And that's where the question that you asked, how can we collaborate with the AOAC in the context of the establishing of this sector today? That is where there would be a lot of synergies that we can work together in ensuring that the network laboratories that use the reference material that get provided in an attempt to shorten the traceability chain, there is proper training where we would need partnerships. There are areas that we are not experts in, we are metrologists, but we would need others to come in, and I think the word is collaboration, ensuring that there is more participation of different role players to ensure that at the end of the day, that collaborative effort ensures the skills levels are raised. And it's very important. I think in our view, as SADC MET and the NMISA, is that there is no shortage of skills training programs. It's the coordination of the skills that we've developed to ensure that it yields a proper outcome that benefits us economically at the end of the day. And that coordination, I think that's an area that we would need a lot of collaboration together. And with the AOAC, that's an area of opportunity that we can start collaborating, ensuring that we know where the skills are and tap into those skills. Not every time we look at the gaps, we then say we need to go into a training program. We look at the gaps and say, where can we source the skills that are already in existence for a specific platform? And I think the fact that there's a lot of Africans that are across the world, in Europe, in the Americas, and all over the world, that work in this field is testament that the skills have been trained, but we need to identify where they are before they leave the continent to go into other parts of the world. I think I'll end it.
Thank you for that. So I guess I'm hopeful that again through the creation of the subsection, the section, Sub-Saharan Africa section, that those needs for methodology development and any type of enabler to the methods and their implementation will be made known to the section and the community of food analysts in the region in order to address those gaps, and also so that the investment go where the needs are. In what you mentioned, clearly you've identified that the investments have to take place not necessarily at a national level, but more at a regional level. And Yves, in your introductory remarks, you've indicated a clear will from African leaders to march towards integration of a number of regulatory provisions, economic integration of the continent as a whole. Can you comment further, if you take the element of food safety and food safety regulatory requirements specifically, how could that be potentially an engine for integration at the continent level or even in sub-regions of the continent?
You thought your question was difficult. Okay, thank you for that question. I think my initial comment is that food is always going to be very important on this continent, as it is in every part of the world. Not only food in terms of food security, but also food safety. And this is what you're alluding to say under the African Continental Free Trade Area. This is what the leaders are essentially recognizing, the fact that food has to be adequate, but not only adequate because of our growing populations, but also it has to be safe because of the hidden threats that we have within the food. And I talk about hidden threats because a number of the parts of Africa, as we know, are still importing food. Despite the fact that we do have great weather, great climate, but we are still importing food. And sometimes the food does come in, not, I'd say substandard in some instances, with some things like aflatoxins and all of those things. So I think this constant battle of trying to ensure that the food is safe, the food is adequate, will continue to be a problem. So coming to the issue that you're referring to, food regulatory issues, this is going to become even more important, as much as standardization is equally important. In line with standards, we know that FSSC 22000, the Food Safety System certification, has become central to providing this, I'll say, first line of defense, as it were, but the capacity building is only starting. As you know, it's a new standard. 22,000 has always been there for some time, but now the new requirements and the prerequisite programs that are associated with food safety system certification demand quite a lot in terms of what is required to be able to fulfill the local requirements on standardization. And as we all know, the export market is continuing to demand high standards of quality in terms of their requirements, whether it's in Asia, that needs our honey, or they need our avocados, or whether it's in the EU, they're constantly upping the bar, raising the bar, which places more demand on the local governments to be able to meet those minimum benchmarks. Now, coming to the issue of regulatory compliance, firstly, I did mention in my earlier remarks that the continent has a huge task ahead of it, given the size, the enormity of the problem, and the size of the continent and the number of different countries that are involved, to try and raise the bar to a certain level in terms of minimum benchmarks. Now, when it comes to regulatory, of course, there's discussions around the issue of creating the national quality infrastructure and trying to beef the quality infrastructure. Also, the policies themselves, in some instances, are not even there, the national quality policies. So when you talk about regulation, and food regulation in particular, you notice that this is a whole new ball game, as it were, for Africa, because all of a sudden we're realizing that you can't just export your product across the border, because yes, your product might be certified, but as Ron said, you will be faced with a number of challenges in terms of regulatory compliance, because you will be required to meet the local requirements of the importing country. And we know that most of the countries are already, they've put in place the pre-shipment inspection, models in place, and that creates more, challenges for the various African countries. But I want to end by saying that yes, there are challenges, but yes, we also have opportunities. So the issue is, how do we bridge the gap between the opportunities and the challenges, and to try and leverage on what we have, because we do have a lot. Our horticultural produce are required in the EU. We know that they're demanding our munched peas, they want our avocados, they want our bananas. I know Sweden wants our bananas. They want all sorts of products that are coming from, our honey. These things are required, but to be able to get there, we need to work very hard to try and see how we can bridge the gap in terms of regulatory compliance. A long answer.
Yeah, no, thank you, and not an easy question, I do realize. So let's hope actually that some of the investments that are upcoming in food safety capacity building will also address the issue of potential convergence of food regulatory systems, not only within the continent itself, so essentially aiming for more intra-regional trade, but also with other parts of the world, so that essentially more market access is being enabled. I guess another area that can be an issue for food safety capacity building investments is the fact that some of the investments tend to be short-lived. They are punctual, they address a particular area, and also it's not that we are lacking some initiatives. There are quite a bit of initiatives. They're not necessarily all coordinated and they're not necessarily also meant to be sustainable. So the question that I would like to ask the panel as a whole is, can you make some recommendations about the imperative of sustainable investments in food safety capacity building, and actually even give some examples about how can that be achieved? So anybody would like to comment on that?
Yeah, let me start by telling a little anecdote that no one's going to believe, but it's really quite true. When I first joined Waters in 2007, and that year I was in Latin America at a conference, and I was approached by a seafood exporter, and he told me, he said, I have 5 consignments of shrimp sitting at a border inspection port in the United States, total value of $1.25 million US, and they've been tested and found to contain chloramphenicol. So I've got $1.25 million at stake here. He said, I will buy this LCMS instrument from you today if you explain to me how it is going to remove the chloramphenicol from those 5 consignments. It's quite true. And of course it can't. The reason that I give you that anecdote is to illustrate the fact that technology in and of itself is not the solution. Technology clearly plays an important role, but we've heard it today from both Ron and from Inaugural, that the importance of the skills of building the human resource and the ability to operate the technology. Back in 2010, I was invited to the World Bank to chair an expert working group looking at capacity building activities, specifically looking at issues that develop around capacity building activities. It caused them to be not as successful as they might otherwise be. As Sam said, there are lots of activities ongoing, so sometimes they're not quite as effective as we would like them to be, but I think he touched on one of the 2 key words that I identified from that working group in the World Bank. Sam talked about sustainability, and that's absolutely critical. And there's another element that goes along with that, very closely aligned, and that is one of scalability, which is critically important also. So the results, we had this expert working group, and we started by having a roundtable discussion, and people highlighting, these were people from FAO and all sorts of organizations you need, people that have been involved in supporting capacity building activities. And it developed into a virtual horror session of stories of failed capacity building activities. Things like organizations supplying technology to a laboratory with no provision for training in the use of the instrumentation. So I might personally went to a laboratory that had a piece of instrumentation that was almost 15 years old, still covered in a dust sheet that had never once been used. There were numerous accounts of instrumentation being supplied with no provision being made for service and maintenance support, so that the first time the instrument breaks down, it falls into disuse and it never gets used again. Another frequent problem was that the operating expense budget isn't provided. So you get the capital budget for the instrumentation, but there's no ongoing operating expense. So they can't afford to buy even the simple reagents that are needed to operate the instrumentation. So, I mean, there are hosts. I could go on for hours and hours on this, but I do want to touch on the other piece, and that is the one of scalability. Because one of the things that came up, almost surprising, it was surprising how many people had encountered this particular issue, where they had delivered training to laboratory personnel in the use of the instrumentation, in the appropriate quality standards, and the appropriate application of accreditation methods, etc. Only to find that when they went back to that lab 6 months or 12 months later, that person had gone, because they suddenly become extremely attractive. They may be the only person in the country that can operate that particular instrumentation or can operate to that level of quality that's required, and so they get recruited off perhaps into industry. Very, very common problem. So one of the things that we've started to do, working with the World Bank and more recently working with the Asian Development Bank, we've been working on a number, we in Waters have been working with those organizations on a number of pilot programs aimed at trying to develop that scalability. And the way that we're doing that is, and we've already heard mention of this on this panel today, is through the use of training of trainers. So that we're not just training an individual who becomes extremely attractive, but we train people who can subsequently train those people that can carry out the analysis. We initially piloted this program under the World Bank in China, which resulted in, I think it was just 4 new trainers, who then subsequently trained around 40 people. And those 40 people were then subsequently tested using proficiency test materials, and the results were really quite dramatic. The people that had not received the training got the same PT materials, and they got around about 50 to 60% of them got the right answer, got a Z score of less than 2. The people that received the training, 100% of them got the right answer, got the good Z score. So it was quite clear that this training of trainer model did work. We've subsequently replicated this with the Asian Development Bank in the Greater Mekong sub-region, and that process is currently underway. And also under the auspices of the World Bank, we've been doing this with India. In India, it's a country of superlatives, clearly the need is vast. But in India, they have created, I think, somewhere in the region of 140 new trainers, with a mandate for each of them. In order to get on this training course, those trainers need to sign up to train at least 5 to 10 people. So you can see that this mechanism does appear to be one that has legs, something that can work, or can really build scalability to address even something that a country the size of India. So I think those are my 2 key buzzwords. It's scalability and sustainability needs to be considered in all programs.
Thank you for that. I guess a couple of final points, please.
Okay, thanks very much. I would just like to add another ability to that, which is flexibility in terms of donor funding. And flexibility in the context that our experience is, it normally comes with a predetermined formula of what should be working in your country. And on that basis, you never get ownership of those. So a lot of the time, lots of money is being spent on training and more training, and a consultant here and a consultant there. And as soon as that owner consultant move out of that process, everything just collapses. Therefore, the issue of flexibility in donor funding and approaches becomes extremely important as well. So I agree with those 2, and add another one, sustainability, as you said, scalability and flexibility is quite important.
Unfortunately, I'm not going to add another ability. But I want to take a different angle to it. And this is, I think, for the African governments as a whole. There's an issue of developing things for somebody else, as opposed to developing them for your own community. And I want to talk to consumer education. And I think if the consumers in the country insist on specific quality, then the sustainability of the training that we give will be assured, because this is used by the community itself. Then the export benefit becomes something that you just take advantage of. And I think that's a very important aspect, that most of the time when you look at what does the training focus on, there's a specific economic intent, which most of the time is export. And in the context of Africa Continental Free Trade Area discussions, this becomes very important, that the whole region should insist, and consumer education is very important to ensure that we insist on things we understand. Thank you.
So I just wanted to add the one angle, that of the private sector. Much has already been said in terms of the technical aspects of what we're discussing under food safety and all of that. But I believe, the private sector have a role to play. And I want to commend Nestle, the global player, in terms of food, and the work that they've done already in terms of shared value. Shared value concept that is being implemented by Nestle speaks to the realization that they cannot exist in isolation, and the need to be able to play their part in terms of responsible investment on the continent and in the world as a whole. And I speak specifically about the issue on capacity building, because I know Nestle is doing a lot of work in terms of trying to reach out to technical organizations that want capacity building and that need it. And I had the privilege of visiting the reference laboratory in Cote d'Ivoire recently, and an impressive investment really by Nestle. And I do commend all private sector players who are in this room, who are already playing their part, to say, continue doing that work. It's really important to be able to bridge that gap, because the gap is there, and the private sector can play a part to strengthen, quality infrastructures, capacity building, and to also help these countries to be able to take ownership of their own vision. Thank you.
One last comment, I think, in this session.
Yes.
I think very important for sustainability and to address some of those issues that were mentioned by all the panelists and by Paul initially is, let's say, network ability. There's another ability for you. I just made it up. But, we've found in our many projects, especially regional projects, that we form, the countries involved and the laboratories involved form effective networks while the funding for a project is there. But once the funding disappears, the networks fall apart. Maybe they remain a little bit informally, but they're not half as effective as they should be. So one approach that we're using these days is to try and initiate or help to initiate sustainable networks to improve sustainability of the results of those projects. And one way to do that, I'll give an example from Latin America and the Caribbean. We helped to initiate a network called RALACA. That's an acronym. I'm afraid I don't speak Spanish, but it's basically the Latin American Caribbean Food Safety Network, Food Safety Laboratory Network. So it started in 2012 with 6 countries involved, 9 institutes in 6 countries, and now there are 52 institutes in 22 countries involved in it. But the important thing is that our funding for that network dried up 4 years ago. So what we did was we encouraged the participants to take ownership of it, and they formed a governing board and a board of governors for the network. They have committees with various countries involved in various committees for different aspects of the work, and they have a real sort of pride of ownership of that network. And they carried on with the type of training, and we used the same type of approach as Paul mentioned, to train the trainers, and that type of network forms a perfect framework for doing that. So you've got lots of trainers who are trained in different countries. They work with all their neighbour countries and train other people to do exactly the same thing, and it's a cascade effect. It works very well. There's a lot I could say about that network. It's very, very, very effective. It's been going for a long time now, and our only involvement at the moment is we have a presence on the Board of Governors, but even if we dropped out, if our management said, you're not doing that anymore, then it's sustainable, it's still going on, and I think that's important. We have initiated or helped to initiate a similar network in Africa. It's called AFOSAN, African Food Safety Network, which has a slightly different mechanisms, different countries, different regions, slightly different mechanisms, but we hope that will continue to develop as well. And just before this morning, I was sitting down at the back here, looking at my laptop, and I thought I'd look up to see how many training courses were held by AFOSAN on a regional basis this year, and there were at least 6 training courses held, only 2 of which we had involvement in. So everyone's helping each other, and I think that helps to improve sustainability.
Well, thank you for that. I guess actually you've brought a number of key values and elements that are needed to support capacity building and its ability to be effective in moving the agenda forward. I'm not going to attempt actually to say everything because I would have to run the panel once again, but definitely the element of empowering the recipients such that they take ownership of the initiatives that are underway, investing on that human capital in the skill sets that need to be developed so that essentially we sustain the effort that has been invested, scalability, sustainability of these efforts. But you've mentioned all along collaboration, and hopefully with the creation of the AOAC Sub-Saharan Africa section, there is another forum that will foster this collaboration. I would like to ask you, because you've been a very compliant audience as I can see, to join me in thanking our panelists for this discussion. I would like to thank you all for staying with us actually until this time of the sessions of the morning.
The first speaker this afternoon, I don't need to introduce him. He was laboring the whole of this morning. So he's already been introduced, and I should invite him. Samuel, what? Please.
Well, thank you very much for this kind introduction. And I don't know who scheduled actually my presentation immediately after lunch. Okay, so basically it's going to be my task to start you off for this second session. What I'm going to be speaking about is probably things that you are all aware of, but it's going to serve hopefully as a reminder of the importance of the work that we all do in the area of method standardization and the way it is linked to regulatory requirements, both within our domestic regulations, but also within the international context. I guess beyond the benefits of food for nutrition, beyond also the functional benefits of food on health overall, foods are very important to the economy because they are amongst the most traded commodities around the world. I believe I saw a figure dating back to 2015 of the World Trade Organization identifying that in 2015 more than $1.5 trillion worth of food products were actually traded internationally, and that figure is meant to increase. So I don't need to make any case about the fact that foods are also a global commodity and that the conditions of food productions have changed significantly over the last 5 decades with a lot of consolidation of the production of a number of ingredients in certain parts of the world. The fact that a food product would be made out of ingredients that practically represent the 5 continents of the planet. And that meant that there was clearly a need to manage the regulatory requirements of food such that the way they are regulated to enter a particular market is not creating an impediment to trade from one nation to the other. And when you examine food regulatory provisions overall, you probably, you know basically that they are made of laws, generally regulations, and then subsequent guidelines. You will see that these rules, not only do they encompass requirements for availability on the market, such as situations of pre-market approval of products like infant formula or food additives as ingredients of food. They also encompass requirements for the products to satisfy certain conditions if they are to stay on the market, like maximum levels of contaminants in food or microbiological criteria. And in a lot of these requirements, you will find not only the requirement in terms of what needs to be achieved, but also how can you ascertain that that requirement is met. And that generally is done through testing and through analytical methods. So in fact, in a lot of the regulatory provisions around the world, the regulations actually encompass requirements about analytical methods that are used in order to ensure compliance with regulations. And in fact, the way you mandate or you select an analytical method for that purpose is part of a sanitary or phytosanitary provision. So essentially, if you are to comply with an MRL for a pesticide or a veterinary drug, generally you have to show, in some instances when required, a certificate of analysis to show that the crop that you are exporting or the crop that you are producing even domestically has a level that is within the limit, and you generally have to use an analytical method. And in a lot of instances, some of these analytical methods or the requirements of their performance are mandated through regulations. Now, since the creation of the WTO in 1995 and the signature of the two key agreements of the World Trade Organization pertaining to food, those are the Sanitary and Phytosanitary Agreement as well as the Technical Barriers to Trade Agreement, and in particular for the SPS Agreement, basically WTO set some conditions about the way some of these measures, those regulatory requirements that govern food from the standpoint of the protection of health, human health in particular, but also animal health and plant health. So WTO set requirements about the way these measures are to be chosen by governments, such that, again, they do not represent an impediment to trade between nations. And essentially, that's a requirement of compliance for every member nation of the World Trade Organization. Now, in particular for the SPS agreement, the SPS agreement, in fact, was more explicit, particularly under Article 5 of the agreement, as to the way governments can select those sanitary and phytosanitary provisions. For example, there is a requirement to fulfill the risk analysis paradigm. There is a requirement to conduct a proper risk assessment in the choice, in the development of that food regulatory provision. In the selection of the risk management measure, there is a need to consider that those measures would not impede international trade. And in order to show how you are fulfilling that you're not impeding international trade, basically the SPS agreement gave a reference. And the reference is Codex standards. So Codex standards, and Codex, I'm sure that you've heard of it already, it's an organization that was born predating the WTO by decades. It was born in 1963 as a result of the Joint Food Standards Program of the World Health Organization and the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. So those two bodies created this joint program, which then developed into an organization by itself, originally made out of 33 countries, the founding countries, and then now gathering over 188 countries and one member organization that is the European Union. And Codex standards are identified in the SPS agreement as the benchmark, the reference. If there is a dispute between different countries on a particular SPS provision, Codex standards would be the reference. And if a country is disputing the other country's measure, basically the disputed country will have to show why they have diverged from Codex requirements, and they have to do so using the risk analysis paradigm. So member countries have in fact to fulfill those obligations by following very closely what Codex does. You probably know that Codex standards are actually voluntary standards. There's absolutely no obligation to apply Codex standards in your own jurisdictions. But through the SPS agreement, that voluntary nature is actually strengthened a bit, because if you diverge from them, and if you are a member of WTO, you have to clearly justify why you are diverging. Now, Codex, as I mentioned, and again, we've heard this morning a presentation when I believe it's Dr. Lowe, when he introduced the quality infrastructure and the importance of quality infrastructure, he put standards at the middle. In fact, I had a discussion with Dr. Lowe earlier, and I mentioned, you've identified ISO mostly as the source of standards. Certainly ISO is an important source of standards, but ISO is a private standards organization, even though, again, the standards are still accessible to a certain extent. And also they are open, they are inclusive in the way they are made up, but they are still considered to be a private set of standards. The reference really for standards for SPS measures essentially are Codex standards. Codex has the mandate, dual mandate, primarily to protect consumers' health and also to enable fair practices in the food trade. And Codex dealt with method since its inception as part of the standard setting process that it has embodied. And in the Codex provisions, methods are listed for their purpose. They are intended mostly to support compliance by regulated parties. So essentially, if I am a food business operator and I need to show compliance with a provision, methods is one of the ways to show that compliance. At the same time, also, if I am a regulator and I need to enforce a provision, actually the use of analytical methods is a way to enforce that particular provision. I'm going to actually share with you an anecdote from my former life as a regulator, as a food regulator. Canada was one of the last countries to develop food allergen labeling provisions. We were, in fact, the first country to advocate for them in 1998, and we were the last country to adopt a food labeling regulations in OECD countries. The reason for that was essentially we were challenged by the stakeholder community on the availability of methods that would enable to fulfill the compliance with the requirements that we were imposing. At the time, Canada required the identification of the sources of gluten in the labeling requirements. And while there were methods available for gluten as a whole, so essentially, basically the family of proteins in all the gluten cereals, there wasn't an easy and accessible method in order to identify each source of gluten, meaning barley, wheat, rye, triticale, and so on. And because of the challenge that we had by the stakeholder community, that regulation didn't go through. Until such time that there was a method that was developed and was made available that enabled that particular, discrimination. So again, the availability of methods for a regulator is essentially a key ingredient in the regulatory arsenal. So methods, I'm sure I'm preaching to the converted here. They are an integral part of the regulatory arsenal to be applied by a food regulatory jurisdiction. And Codex is our guide, essentially, for getting that harmonization of those requirements. And in fact, Codex set a subsidiary body, that is the Codex Committee on Methods of Analysis and Sampling, that is hosted by the government of Hungary, that in fact deals specifically with the review and the endorsement of the methods that would be used in conjunction with the application of a Codex standard. So CCMAS basically is the body that proposes to the Commission those international methods that are intended to verify the application of Codex standards. And you read in CCMAS principles that these methods should be used for reference in calibration of methods in use or introduced for routine examination and control purposes. So again, methods are part also of the international regulatory provisions arsenal. Now, where does AOAC come to the fold in that system? Well, I don't know, how many of you have attended the CCMAS meeting? How many of you have survived the CCMAS meeting? Let me put it this way. Okay, few of you. It's probably one of the most technical meeting of Codex. Okay, and actually I say really survived because, at the end of the day, you sometimes, think, okay, where was I today? Because, discussing stats and, applicability of methods and so on. But for those who have attended the CCMAS meeting, you probably have noticed that most of the decisions are actually made before the Monday the start of the meeting. Most of the decisions are made on Saturday. On Saturday before the start of the meeting. And that's the meeting where Codex, so the Codex Secretariat, supported by Hungary as the host country, meets with a number of organizations, and guess who is there? AOAC International is there, IDF is there, and ISO is there. And generally, actually, it's even called, to a certain extent, the interagency meeting, and there is a discussion about those methodologies, and there is a recommendation that is made about the applicability or the suitability of these methods. Generally, all the decisions are made on Saturday, and it's very rare that there is a divergence from those discussions. So essentially, AOAC International is practically an expert advisor to Codex, or can be actually an expert advisor to Codex. And we've heard actually in this morning's presentation by David how essentially, a number of methods that were validated and were endorsed through the AOAC process, how they made their way in order to become international standards. There is, in fact, more to do in this particular area, and I'm hopeful, again, with the fulsome representation of AOAC International across the globe, we will be able, as an organization, to basically advocate for methodology needs for other parts of the world and actually make them available through international Codex standards. Now, when we look at what AOAC International can do in this regard, again, our role as a standardization agency is essentially to develop those parameters against which methods that are developed by our food analytical community are to be assessed. So one of the ways we do that is we develop the standard method performance requirements, which are essentially the minimum requirements of performance of a method against which those methods could apply to the AOAC system such that they can actually be reviewed by experts, once, of course, all those requirements are being fulfilled and all the collaborative studies have been conducted and so on, so that essentially they get that level of expert recognition. So AOAC International helps review that performance and actually gives, therefore, the level of confidence that is needed for those methods, potentially giving them access to the international standard setting system. And perhaps most importantly, what our organization does is essentially the creation of community of practice, the creation of community of expertise, where we can learn from each other, where we can identify the needs of each other, and where we can help each other through the development, implementation of new methods, new technologies, and trying to address those emerging issues of food safety and food quality. So what we're hoping is that the Sub-Saharan section of AOAC will contribute in bolstering the food analytical community through the propagation of best practices in the selection and use of food analytical methods. Also, hopefully that this part of the world will help also harmonize the practices of selection of methods that are used to address a number of food safety and food quality requirements, and overall contribute the participation of the expertise from the region to the overall global effort. Now, we're trying to have some contribution in this regard. Our university and our platform of risk analysis and regulatory excellence was recipient last year of a grant from the US Department of Agriculture through the Foreign Agricultural Service, as well as the USAID, the US Agency for International Development, to support the enhancement of food regulatory policies in West Africa with an emphasis on Senegal and Côte d'Ivoire. And in fact, with the collaboration of a number of partners who are present here, so essentially the Nestlé Group with the government of Côte d'Ivoire, the government of Senegal, a number of other West African nations, we actually helped organize one of the meetings that Owen actually showed in his milestone slides in April of 2018, where we met and actually we discussed how AOAC International and how this particular section could contribute in the creation of that community of practice for the selection and the endorsement of methods that is of use for this particular region. So I wish well to AOAC Sub-Saharan Africa in this endeavor. Thank you very much for including me in the program, and happy to answer any questions if you have any. Thank you.
When he said he wasn't going to take too long, he really meant it. Okay. We will have a question time at the end of the three speakers. Okay. Now we invite Ms. Diane Denish. Diane Denish is a Global Regulator Affairs Manager in 3M Food Safety, where she provides leadership to global teams to help drive recognition and acceptance of global methods with their region, and actively partners with government and non-government organizations to participate in development of standards and methods. She is a member of the Inaugural General Committee, IAFP, and the US ISO Technical Advisory Group, where she is a co-chair of the ISO drafting group developing ISO 16440 Part 3 method verification. She is a fellow of AOAC International and currently serves as IOAC International Board of Directors as past president. Diane holds a Bachelor's of Science degree in medical technology from the College of Pathology, University of Minnesota, mini masters in international business from the University of St. Paul, Minnesota, and a certificate in international food law through Michigan State University. Please join me to welcome Diane.
Good afternoon. I'm really glad to be speaking here for a couple of reasons. One, I'm super tired, so if I had to listen to me, I'd fall asleep for sure. Sorry. And two, my colleague Erin, who you'll hear speak tomorrow, she's the chair of the official methods board for AOAC. We've tried for the last 2 mornings to take a hot air balloon ride, and both days we drive an hour and 20 minutes north of here, and both days we get there and the wind is too strong. So we've been up since 3 o'clock for the last 2 days, so we're tired. But I was happy when we got here about 10 o'clock and we barely got a seat. So I'm so happy to see so many of you here today. Thank you so much for being so supportive of this section. So with that, I'll get started. Oops, I should talk a little bit about this first. So even though this is an AOAC meeting and I'm speaking about ISO, but as you heard, we're partners. We're working even more closely now for the next 5 years in other areas under the Technical Committee 34 on food. So it will include perhaps some work with microbiology. I don't know, none of the decisions have been made on the topics, but it opens the opportunity that perhaps we can. So it was recognized quite a while ago, and you can look at me and tell that I was here over 30 years ago in the food industry, and when rapid methods were getting started, and more people wanted to use methods that were quicker than the reference method, cheaper to use, easier to train, probably less bio-waste in many cases as well, and get faster results. But the problem was, will government agencies accept the results if we use these methods? And so the European norm started a project called Eureka to develop some kind of technical rules that could be followed to do the comparison of an alternative method to a reference method. And it was first developed as ISO 16140. So it's evolved since that time, but even when you look at the regulation for Europe on microbiology, the Directive 2073, it really legislates the methods that should be used to test for certain commodities. and that's for whether you're within Europe or if you're exporting to Europe. And so they could be either ISO methods, SEN methods. They also can be the country's own method, but the regulation states ISO SEN methods first, and then a country method if there's not one available. Or, now the law also states a proprietary method can be used. Proprietary means, so I work for a 3M company. We make methods that you can't make in your lab. The way to make them is proprietary to us. It's just a trade secret kind of. So proprietary methods can be validated compared to a reference method following the protocol that's listed in ISO standard 16140. And this should be done through a certified organization, a third-party certified organization. Here is the exact wording. You can see some people have missed this within the regulation. So it's in Article 5 if you want to take a look at it. But if you look in the annexes, it lists the specific methods that must be used as the reference if you do a method comparison to an ISO method. So there are 3 recognized schemes that use ISO 16140 as their major protocol to compare an alternative method to the reference method. And these are AFNOR, which is the French National Organization for Standardization. They are also the member body to ISO, AFNOR is. There's MicroVal, that you've heard a little talk about maybe. So that's a certification body based out of the Netherlands, and it is run by the organization NEN, which is also the ISO member to ISO for the Netherlands. And then NordVal, which is it's a Nordic certification body, and it's mainly 5 Nordic countries that follow this particular methods that are validated through this particular scheme. But if you're exporting to those countries, that can be important to you. So the first ISO standard 16140 was published in 2003. I'm sorry, I'll back off so I'm not puffing it all the time. So ISO documents are reviewed every 5 years. And so after this document was created, 5 years later, there was some update to it. An amendment was added in 2011, and that was done following a project that AOAC had done in partnership with ISO and a number of other organizations to try to harmonize some of the criteria in the protocol of ISO 16140 to the AOAC guidelines. And so following that project that we did, some updates and amendment was made, but they still were working on the final update to the document. So they were preparing for that standard. And at that same time, the thought was, maybe we need to take a broader look at what ISO 16140 covers. Maybe it's broader than just a method validation. Maybe there are certain parts of method validation that need to be also examined. So the decision was made or defined into 6 parts. 2 have been published. The first one is on terminology, and it's the terminology that's used throughout all 6 parts of the ISO 16140 standard. And then the one that was originally just 16140 now is 16140 Part 2. And so that gives you all the criteria for doing the validation compared to a reference method. The next 4 were new ones that came up. Method verification. People have talked about method verification for a long time. It's very important, so it was thought that we should create a standard that defines how to do that. In-house single laboratory method validation. So if you're just going to use the method in your own lab and other companies aren't going to be using it, here is the process for you to do that. When we do the validation, part of it is do a method comparison in-house, and then you do a collaborative study or inter-laboratory study. And it's very cumbersome. It's challenging to get enough labs to participate because you need about 15 labs willing to participate in the hopes that you get 10 good data sets to use in the end. And so a statistician came up with this idea to, let's do a factorial design and reduce the number. So I'll talk a little more about that. And the last is validating confirmation methods, because right at this time there was no way to do that. So as I said, the first one, Part 1, has been published in 2016. It's only 20 pages long, And it really just gives, here's the scope, here are the terms, and here's the bibliography. And all of these criteria, all those definitions we continue to use as we develop the other parts to 16.140. Part 2 is the one that was prior, now it was updated and published in 2016. And it's the same thing, comparing still to a reference or standard method. It eliminated the first 16.140 after publication, so this is the one that's in place now and part of the regulation. It has 2 parts, as I mentioned, a comparative study comparing to the reference method to show that you are equivalent or not statistically different is probably the more correct term. And then you must do the collaborative study. So most government agencies require a collaborative study. They'll say it's great that you can do the method and it works in one lab, but we need to see that it works in many labs because that's who's going to be using it. And as I mentioned, this was harmonized with the project through AOAC, ISPAM, the ISPAM project, International Stakeholder Panel on Analytical Methods, ISPAM. And it's used to do methods conducted through a certification body. So it's not something you necessarily would do in your own lab. It's quite complicated and complex. And if you did it, I don't know that it would be recognized because you can't certify it yourself. And so a certification body is important to have this work done through them. Part 3 is one that many people are interested in. This is the one that I'm a co-chair on with a colleague from Nestle, Benjamin Deep. And we've been working on it for too many years. We're expected to publish by the end of this year, and if we do not, we'll have exceeded our time that's allowed within ISO, and we'll have to start all over. And so we really are working hard to make sure that this gets published this year. We had a lot of discussion about this. It was a very everybody has an opinion on how you should do verification, and everyone, of course, is right. So there was one group of people that thought, okay, when you do a method validation, you have to test out of 15 food categories. Part 2 lumps everything into 15 food categories, and if you test 5 of those food categories, you can make the claim that your method works for a broad range of food. It used to be all foods, but that was one change that was made after the project with AOAC is you didn't test all foods, so you really can't claim all foods. You can claim a broad range of foods, but it is implied that it is applicable to all 15 groups of foods. And so one group thought for verification, you're going to have to pull foods from every one of those 15 categories and test, which could get up to 75 different samples that you do just to verify the method. Almost getting close to, you're doing another validation in your own lab. And then there's the opposite said, you just need to do one sample and that will prove that you can use the method. So one from the Midwest in the US, and we're usually not a very cantankerous, forceful group. We're quiet, we try to get along. I don't represent them well, as people know. I'm not like that. But in general, that's what we're like. But people were angry and shouting. I've never been in a meeting like that, but very passionate about wanting to get this right, what they thought was right. I'll show you in a minute what we decided. No, I guess I did put it here. We decided it's going to consist of a 2-step process. First, the method has been validated. You have the published data. Take one of the foods that was used in the validation study, test it in your lab, and compare your results to the results that are in the validation study. That proves you can use the method in your lab. Part 2, does it work with the type of matrices you use in your lab, you test in your lab? So you need to choose 5 matrices and make them challenging matrices, so you're really challenging how the method will work for the matrices that you'll be testing and putting your name on the result, and test those. And so we came to some agreement. It's 5 categories you choose when you do broad range, so we figured 5 foods for that verification testing. Part 4, as I mentioned, is a single lab validation. So verification isn't required because you've done the validation in your lab. You don't need to re-verify that you can use the method you already validated. So that's one advantage for that. So you can you can do your validation following 16 part 2 as well, and use parts of part 5, which I'll talk about next. And this was, because it is a challenge, as I said, to find a number of labs to partake. This was one way to use, I used factorial design when I was in product development, and I really enjoy it because you choose certain factors and then you alternate them in the design to not do as much testing, but to still get a lot of statistical data. So when it was first proposed at one of our drafting meetings by this statistician, and I appreciate statisticians, but you're not a microbiologist, so what do you know? And so I really questioned, I do not believe this was going to work. And he said, well, it'd be great if we could do a study. And so I did ask my boss, and he is a master's in statistics. Oh yeah, this sounds great. So we did conduct a study, and we did, instead of 4 labs, that's the minimum you need to have, I chose 5 labs. We had one in Canada, one was FDA in the US, one was the Q Laboratories, where Aaron works, that was administrating the samples. One was in France, and another contract lab, and then 3M we participated because it was one of our Petrifilm plates. It was just simple to ship for people, and we used a dried sample so we could ship that as well. And so we conducted the test, and it worked. And so I was really pleased to be wrong because I wanted it to work, but I didn't believe it would work for micro. So it's one of the examples that's used in the annex in this document, in this standard. So that was a good piece of news. But today, when it's published, it can only be used for non-proprietary methods. Because it's too new a concept, ISO didn't want it to open up for non-proprietary methods to use. So a method like 3M, we can't use it for our validation studies at this point. I think when it comes for the next 5 years to be reviewed, we'll have enough data to prove that, yes, it's working, and we can now expand the use of it to proprietary methods. And then part 6, as I mentioned, is about confirmation. And so this was a really important one that has been talked about for quite a while because it's a little bit messy when you talk about confirmation, and everybody has a different way of doing confirmation. So this was a way then to get the confidence that, yes, you're validating also your confirmation step. I wanted to talk a little bit about the part 2 and part 3. Both were considered by ISO to be really high-profile documents because the globe really wants to use rapid methods, and so part 2 is important, so we can show that we can validate them to be equivalent, similar. And part 3, because there's no standard available, in fact, I only know of 2 published procedures, I would say, for verification. One is the US FDA BAM manual, Appendix 3, has a very small section, part 4, on verification. And it's a guideline. So it's really not, they have an actual SOP, a standard operating procedure that FDA uses, but it's confidential, so it's not available. But it gives you at least an idea. If you need something before this standard is published, it's something to take a look at. And then Health Canada, they were part of the early stages of development of this, and they ended up getting theirs done and published in 2015, I believe it is. And you can find that online as well. If you look up the Compendium of Methods, Health Canada, and it'll pop up, and it's in Volume 1, Part 5 of Volume 1. And you'll click on the link thinking you're going to get the document, and you won't see the document, you'll get an email address. So you just send a note, please send me this document, and with 24 hours they'll send the document to you. So, I can get off track here. So, because this was such a high-profile document, and because so many of the experts working on it, I don't think work in labs anymore, I said, I think we should test this like we do at 3M when we have a new product. We send it to customers to get their feedback, just make sure we're on the right track. And so we decided, yeah, let's see if we can do that. ISO had never done that before, but they were open to it. And so they allowed us to go ahead. We decided, I said, what we have to do before we begin is decide the criteria for acceptance. Because if you wait till you get your data in, just like when you're doing statistics, you can't do the study and then say, okay, now we need a statistician to look at the data. You need the statistician to help you design it before you start. So you're really collecting the information that you need to make your decision. And so we agreed we'd have to have at least 30 labs around the globe that would participate and get response from. And they couldn't just be big labs. They'd have to be a variety of sizes. And they had to be in different global regions, and where English isn't the primary language in some cases, and different types of laboratories. And then we had a questionnaire for each of the sections within the document, and they were to rate how well they could understand it on a scale of 1 to 5. And they had to be 3, which was okay, or better, or higher. And then we had to get those responses of 3 or higher from 75% of the labs at least, just to know that they really could follow and understand the document. And of those who could try to actually use the document to do a verification study, we wanted that input as well. So the request was sent out to the subcommittee 9, which is microbiology, to ask how many countries would have people who would be willing to participate. And we had 30 respond. And I said, well, that means every one of them is going to have to participate, or we won't meet our criteria and we can't use the data. And so I and Benjamin from Nestle Global Companies, we contacted our colleagues in the regions and said, do you have customers, governments that you work with, people you work with? And we got 30 more. So we had 60 labs now that were willing to participate. And to our delighted surprise, we had an 80% response rate. So yes, I can see people are very interested in getting this document. And we had a good kind of mix of the kinds of labs that participated. So over half of them were large, but we did have small and medium-sized labs. And my symbols there are full-time equivalents, so a full-time person. So less than 5 or equivalent to 5 is a small lab. And then you can see the different lab types. We had a good mix of variety of government and academia and contract labs. And then regions, we had my concern was that we would get the US and Europe, and we'd miss all the other important countries. And so we were happy that we did get a pretty good blend. Some regions we didn't get as heavy response as others, but they aren't as involved in ISO, so they weren't available to help. And then when we looked at each of the criteria, we did identify there were certain sections that we really did get below the 3 response, and so we had to look a little closer at those and beef them up. When we looked at qualitative methods, most of the sections there were understood fairly well. Quantitative sections for each of the sections within those areas, they followed very well. But those that tried to use the document to do a verification study showed us that there are some areas that we need to do some more work. So where we are today, the public it has to publish by the end of 2019 to meet ISO criteria. We have a document that's out now as a final draft international standard. It's a pre-final draft international standard. It's 35 pages long, which is the protocol to do the study for both qualitative and quantitative methods, and then a lot of examples. So again, 35 more pages with examples and annexes. And we also were asked to create a transition document. One had been created for ISO 16140 Part 2 to help people move from the first version into the new version because a lot of changes were made. And since this is a brand new document, a transition document was written and is being reviewed that would be used by labs and technical assessors and accreditation bodies, how they'll use this then when it's released. And for methods that are, this was a big discussion too, methods that are currently under the scope of the lab, so they're already accredited, will not have to be redone following this new document when it's released, which was a big relief for many people because it could be a big undertaking. So everything that you're already accredited for does not need to be repeated. So here are some of the next steps. So for Part 3, our last working group meeting was in Helsinki in May, and we made big changes. Part of the problem is not all of the working members show up each time. So when someone hasn't shown up for a while and they show up, wait a minute, I thought, and we revisit the discussion. Sometimes that's good because we forget something. Sometimes it's just frustrating, but we did make some good changes, I think, at this lesson. So we've sent this out for our pre-review, as I said. And then parts 4 through 6 are also submitted for their final draft review. They'll be probably published by mid-2019, but all will be by the end of the year. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Okay, the last speaker in this section is Warren Potts. Warren received his BA in Analytical Chemistry at our university in 1990, and MS in Biochemistry from University of Medicine and Dentistry of New Jersey in 1992, and an MBA from Auburn University in 2006. For the past 19 years at Waters, Warren has used his experience from working in pharmaceutical and petrochemical industry to bring new LC and LCMS technologies and analytical methodologies to the market. In his current role, he and his team focus on helping laboratories based on businesses to be more productive through collaboration with customers and commercialization of new sections in the Americas. Warren.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. You don't look very tired, which means that you're not overburdened with undigested food, so that's good. So what I want to talk to you about for the next 20 minutes or so is really kind of the Waters philosophy about engaging in activities like this and capacity building discussions. And I will give you some examples, some of which Paul touched on earlier in the panel discussion. The key thing for us is that at the core of our kind of corporate philosophy is delivering benefit. And that comes from when the company was founded in 1958 by Jim Waters. And his whole bend was ensuring that there was benefit delivered to customers, to people, so that it could change the world. So you see here on our kind of updated slide on the far right, let's see if I can get this up. Over here we have 4 key stakeholders. That is our customers, our employees, our stockholders, because we are a publicly traded company, and probably equally as important, the communities that we serve. And those communities are global, both on individual employee level, but also at the corporate level. And the types of problems that we try to deal with, or that we are confronted with by this, is broad-based. Whether it's, can I sell a certain foodstuff to a given market? Are the composite materials used in a jetliner, some of us probably flew on the way down here, are they the right ones to keep that plane in the air? Are the drug products that are being developed actually effective and safe for people to use for diseases? Is the water safe? Is it loaded with all kinds of stuff, industrial pollutants, or is it clean? Well, what was this patient poisoned with? So our technologies cut across a broad swath of different markets, if you will, or different applications. And food is one of the important ones. So food's important. So there's probably 2 things in the world that are going to be driving us as a global family: is food availability and water availability. That's going to have to change how we go about making sure that this stuff is safe. And the way in which we can do that is by ensuring that we have the appropriate management of these different activities. So from a food safety perspective, we've already heard today from all the speakers and the panelists around regulatory systems are key. Being able to enforce standards. If you have regulations that are not enforced, then they're not worth what the paper they're written on. Hazard control systems, and something that's near and dear to my heart is around the laboratory verification, because you can have all these things, but without having the testing to show that it's in compliance, it makes it really hard to keep that moving forward. So I like this one around food security. It has changed over the last few decades around self-sufficiency in the major staples back in the 50s and 60s, which then came around to having access to sufficient food. And then in 1996, in the World Summit, we had both physical and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food. So that upscales what we have to do as far as that goes, which is very good. Now, I like looking at this in a variety of ways. One is taking a look at, is it available? Okay, is it accessible or affordable? And the next two are safe and nutritious. And then I like this other one, which is authentic. There's many reasons why authenticity is important. One is economic. People substituting lower products for something that people would pay a lot of money for. Or things that look the same that could actually lead to deleterious health effects. And I'll give examples a little bit later. So testing, as I said, is important. So we look at, we have to be able to use testing to ensure regulatory compliance. I like the concept of moving from specific methodologies to performance-based testing, because that then allows for some of the newer technologies to be utilized as they come in if they can actually deliver on the requirements that are needed. And then making sure that everything that is done is fit for purpose. And I'll give an example in the next slide around that. So from a consumer protection perspective, we could use simple script tests, for instance, to do some of that rudimentary early screening, if you will, for a positive, negative. Whereas from an industry perspective, you may want to go a little deeper, dig a little deeper, and make sure that you have accurate, precise, robust, and sensitive tests. If you're looking for residues in food, for instance, that would be able to deliver the appropriate results. Now, when we look at residue identification, selectivity is key, because food is not a fun matrix, because there's a lot of other stuff that's in there, and you have to be able to distinguish between the things that you're looking for to ensure they're not in, versus all that background that happens to be in the sample. So whether it's meat or fruit or whatever, you're going to be dealing with very different matrix effects in that analysis. And you want to make sure that those interferences do not impede or basically interfere with the measurements that you're trying to make. Now, we talked a little bit about authenticity. So here's kind of 4 examples. One of my favorite is olive oil. Most of the olive oil, at least in the US you buy, it's not really olive oil. Or it's a little bit of olive oil and some other oil in there, right? Speciation or species identification. You can look at tuna substitution with Escobar, and this is where some health effects can come in, because Escobar can actually lead to some GI issues. So if you're really into sushi and you think you're eating tuna and you're not, you may not be having fun now when you get home after that. And then around production method, there's a lot of focus on sustainability in production and ensuring that the right amount of stuff is being used, or if it's organically grown, which is one of my favorite concepts as a chemist. I don't eat too much inorganic food, by the way. But looking at organically grown, how do you verify that that is actually organically grown, or doesn't have any GMO in, or whatever the label claim is? And then finally, looking at food quality and profiling. This is a good one, because this picture kind of illustrates something that happened in the UK a few years back, where it wasn't all beef. Unfortunately, in the red meat, there was a little bit of horse in there that got into the food stream. So when you look at that, ensuring that the stuff that we say is in the tin is actually in and nothing else. And there's technologies that help us do all of this stuff, which I will not go into at the moment. So that's great. So we have all these things that we can do, but how do we make sure that labs can do them around the world? And it all comes down to collaborative capacity building, which we've already heard today about the importance of that. And that's what I want to spend the rest of our time. From water's perspective, it's about those public-private partnerships that allow these types of things to happen. And I'll give you a couple of examples. So working with key stakeholders around the world is critical to that. Both people that help fund and kind of give direction, as well as the folks that are in territory that are trying to set up things, laboratories. And we look at the GFSP model, scoping out what's going on, ensure that the training, and this comes down to what Paul talked about, training the trainer and others. Key thing is you don't give the people to fish, you teach them how to fish, so that when the initial wave is gone, it is sustainable after that. And using basically exemplar or very good training laboratories, ones who exemplify how to actually do the work in a good fashion. Best practices are used in this. And then basically write out your implementation and plan and then ensure that proficiency testing happens. Now, one of the things that, once this is all said and done and the first wave packs up and leaves, that proficiency testing has to continue. You have to continue to evaluate and ensure that you can get the right results when given a set of samples. And then evaluate and make changes as necessary. Now, Paul talked briefly about this in the panel discussion about the China Lab training pilot. And the nice thing about this is his words are now actually shown on screen, so you can kind of visualize what he said. And at the end of the day, after the training, the people who were trained were able to pass that proficiency test with almost 100% score, whereas those that weren't trained did not show nearly the type of results that are needed. And I think that right there is a picture of why proficiency testing and training of these people is critical. We also talked a little bit about training in India. We talked about basically starting out the process with train a whole bunch of people and say, all right, now your job is to train the next set of people, and so on and so forth, to multiply the number of folks in the country that can actually do the training and help to build up the testing systems and ensure quality testing results. And then one round that was done in Southeast Asia, again, talking about going out with key folks and making sure that you train the appropriate people and then spread them out and continue kind of to test and make sure that they're able to continue that on as they move forward. Now, it mentions here a training center. We just opened, I think it was about a month and a half ago, the International Food and Water Research Center in Singapore, which Waters has outfitted. And the goal there is to be able to provide scientists a place to come to do work on cutting-edge technology for food and water research. And that is a little picture of the lab. And the whole goal here, again, goes back to providing benefit to the community, which is to try to improve human health ultimately. So I've kind of caught us back up now, so we can have time for questions. But if we kind of summarize it from our perspective at Waters, it's about delivering benefit, and being involved in these type of activities is one way in which we can do that. We do this also for other areas in pharmaceutical and clinical diagnostics, things that are going to be important for human health. And we try to ensure that we can leverage our experience and network to help facilitate these things. So thank you all for your attention. You've been a great group. I'm glad nobody's sleeping yet. That's good.
Do you have questions to any one of our speakers?
Yeah, I think it's, no, I've forgotten your name. Deanne. Deanne, okay. So if Deanne is not focused on a hot air balloon, right.
I've given up.
No, you've given up. Don't give up. Looking at the ISO standard that you're busy with, I wonder to what degree rapid testing is considered a proprietary method in itself. My experience is that rapid testing tends to be associated with specific manufacturers, and therefore I'm struggling a little bit to understand the differentiation between a standard old-fashioned method, if I can use that word, and a rapid test, because a rapid test often is associated with a specific supplier of the technology, viewed as very proprietary, viewed as not something that the average other supplier could duplicate.
Right.
So I wondered, whether this has any influence on the standard, and whether, it's something that we should be concerned about, especially those in the laboratory world.
So a non-proprietary method, it really rapid methods usually aren't associated with one or two suppliers. It's anyone in that other room that has a booth at any big conference. Those are all usually rapid methods and non-proprietary methods. So it's gotten pretty big, and it's really the old traditional cultural method that is the old method. So anything that is not that is pretty much a proprietary method these days. So I think it's universal. I don't know if that answered your question or if you have more.
Okay, thank you.
There was someone sitting in front of me in the back too. She has. Oh,
there's a hand over there, right at the end.
Go ahead. Okay, on your presentation you showed when you were testing that you had 4% of participants from Africa and Middle East. What percentage was Africa on its own?
It was probably, I think it was just 1, maybe 2 labs in South Africa. I don't remember if it was a government lab. I know a contract lab for sure, but I don't remember if there was one other that was a different lab.
Okay. There's another hand near the column there.
Thank you very much. My question, I'm Valerie, and my question is, I wanted to ask, where does academia meet with industry? A lot of research is done in the universities, and I'm wondering how are these methods, like the ones that are good that have been published, does the AOAC or ISO try to implement some of these methods that have been developed and try to see if they can work, or industry, they work independently and academia work independently, or where do the two meet?
I can speak for AOAC for sure, because to get an AOAC approval, you get a first action approval first. When they look over all the data, the expert review panel reviews the data that you provide from the study that has been done at an independent laboratory. And they'll say, if you meet the requirements, and all the reviewers agree, then you are given first action approval. And then the method is used for 2 years in the market, and you have to go back to that same review panel and provide any information that you have from customers who use the test, if they had an issue with the test, what you did to resolve that issue. If you had to make a change to your method, it's no longer a valid method because you've made a change. But if there's been no change to the method and no real issue in the industry, then the expert review panel will grant you a final action. So that's an industry input. And I can tell you, it's taken very seriously, because 3M had a product, our Petrifilm product, our coliform plate, back in the late 80s when we were going for final action approval. And a customer of ours was using our plate, and they were receiving a shipment of flour from another supplier who used the MPN method. And the MPN method showed no coliform, but Petrifilm showed coliform. So they reported it to AOAC, and AOAC had to investigate then, and they asked for a contract lab to gather flour samples from around the US and test comparing the MPN method and the Petrifilm method. And there weren't coliform in the MPN method, but there were on the plate, Petrifilm plates, so they picked the colonies and confirmed them as Enterobacter coaceae, and they were fermenting lactose to produce acid and gas, which is the requirement for a coliform. And so they retested, and this time for the MPN tubes, they put oil on the top, and then they were able to detect very minute amounts of gas. So it was determined that in this particular case, the 3M method was more sensitive than the MPN method. And I'll just say, because I'm in regulatory, that doesn't mean our method is more sensitive than the MPN method in all things. It was in this particular case for this particular matrix. But because they did find it was coliform, they granted our final action. But that's how serious AOAC will take industry comments to follow through to make sure that the method is valid and robust.